I thought generosity was a virtue until I discovered my daughter-in-law had been keeping a detailed spreadsheet of every dollar I'd given them, not out of gratitude, but to calculate exactly how much more she could squeeze out of me before cutting me off completely. What she didn't know was that I had been keeping my own records, and my final entry would be one she'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sunlight filtered through my kitchen window as I prepared my usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, the same routine I'd maintained for the past 3 years since my husband Robert passed away. At 62, I had settled into a comfortable rhythm of quiet mornings, afternoon gardening, and evenings spent reading or watching my favorite cooking shows. My name is Margaret Walsh, and if someone had told me a year ago that my carefully ordered life would spiral into the kind of family drama you see on daytime television, I would have laughed and poured them another cup of coffee. The phone rang, just as I was finishing my second cup of morning coffee, and I smiled when I saw my son David's name on the caller ID. David had always been my pride and joy, a smart boy who grew into an ambitious man with dreams bigger than our small Pennsylvania town could contain. After graduating from college with a business degree, he'd moved to Philadelphia where he met and married Amanda, a stunning blonde with perfectly manicured nails and an equally perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," I answered warmly, settling back into my favorite kitchen chair, the one with the floral cushion that Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. "Hey, Mom." David's voice sounded tired, strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Listen, I hate to ask this, but we're in a bit of a tight spot financially. Amanda's been looking at this amazing opportunity to start her own interior design business, and we need about $15,000 to get it off the ground." I felt that familiar tug in my chest, the same one I'd experienced countless times over the years whenever David needed help. After Robert's death, his life insurance policy had left me more comfortable than I'd ever been, and helping my only child had become not just a choice, but almost a compulsion. In the past 18 months alone, I'd helped them with a down payment on their townhouse, covered Amanda's car payments when David's sales job hit a rough patch, and quietly taken care of their credit card debt after Amanda's last shopping spree. "Of course, honey," I heard myself saying before I'd even fully processed the request. "I can transfer the money this afternoon." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Amanda's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. Then David came back on the line, his tone noticeably brighter. "Thanks, Mom. You're the best. Amanda says she'll send you a thank you card." "That's not necessary," I began, but he'd already moved on to telling me about their weekend plans. Some charity gala that Amanda insisted they attend for networking purposes. As I listened to him describe the expensive dress Amanda had picked out and the exclusive venue, I found myself wondering when my son had become someone who needed charity galas to feel successful. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The house felt especially quiet that morning, the kind of silence that makes you notice the ticking of clocks and the settling of old wood floors. I walked to my home office, a small room that had once been Robert's den, and opened my laptop to transfer the money. As the bank's website loaded, I caught sight of the framed photo on my desk. David at his college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride and possibility. That afternoon, I decided to surprise them with a visit. I'd baked David's favorite chocolate chip cookies, the same recipe my mother had used when I was growing up, and thought it might be nice to deliver them in person along with a bottle of champagne to celebrate Amanda's new business venture. The drive to Philadelphia took about an hour, and I spent it listening to classic rock and thinking about how proud Robert would have been to see David pursuing his dreams. Their townhouse was in one of those newly developed neighborhoods where every house looked almost identical, except for the color of the shutters and the style of the front door. David and Amanda's was painted a soft gray with white trim and Amanda had insisted on installing elaborate landscaping that required professional maintenance. I parked in their driveway behind Amanda's BMW and gathered my gifts from the passenger seat. As I approached the front door, I could hear voices coming from inside. The windows were open to let in the spring air, and their conversation drifted out clearly. I raised my hand to knock, then froze as I heard my name. "Margaret transferred the money already," Amanda was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was pleased with herself. God, she's so predictable. I swear, all I have to do is mention money troubles and she practically throws her wallet at us. I stood there on their front porch, holding a plate of homemade cookies and a bottle of champagne, feeling like someone had just dumped ice water over my head. David's laugh followed, and it was a sound I'd never heard from him before. Cold and calculating. She's been living alone in that big house for 3 years now. I think she's just desperate to feel needed. Makes it easier for us. I've been keeping track, you know, Amanda continued, and I could hear papers rustling. In the past 18 months, she's given us almost $60,000. The house down payment, my car, the credit cards, and now this business thing. I figure we can probably get at least another 40 or 50 out of her before we need to start setting some boundaries. The plate in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. I wanted to turn around, walk back to my car, and pretend I'd never heard any of this, but I couldn't move. I was trapped there, listening to my son and daughter-in-law discuss me like I was some kind of financial resource they were managing. "The best part," David said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, "is that she never asks questions. Never wants to see receipts or proof of anything. She just hands over the money and feels good about being the supportive mother." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "It's actually kind of sad," Amanda replied, though her tone suggested she found it more amusing than tragic. "But hey, if she wants to fund our lifestyle while she sits in that house talking to her plants and watching cooking shows, who are we to stop her?" They both laughed then, and the sound cut through me like a physical blow. I set the cookies and champagne down quietly on their porch table and walked back to my car on unsteady legs. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The drive home passed in a blur of tears and rage, and something else I couldn't quite name. Humiliation, maybe. Or perhaps it was the particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone who's still alive. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the sun was setting, painting my house in shades of gold and amber that should have been beautiful, but instead felt like a mockery. I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. The house welcomed me with its familiar smells of lavender and old wood, but even that comfort felt hollow now. I walked through rooms that suddenly seemed too big, too empty, filled with furniture and memories that belonged to a version of myself I wasn't sure existed anymore. In my office, I pulled up my banking records and began scrolling through the transfers I'd made over the past year and a half. Amanda was right about the total, though she'd actually underestimated by about $5,000. $65,000 I'd given them, not including the smaller amounts for dinners out, weekend trips, and what David always called little emergencies. I opened a new document on my computer and began typing. If Amanda was keeping a spreadsheet, then I would keep my own records. But mine would be different. Mine would track not just the money I'd given, but the lies they'd told to get it, the promises they'd broken, and the trust they'd systematically destroyed. The first entry was easy. Interior design business startup, $15,000. Actual purpose, unknown. Likelihood of legitimate business venture, low. As I typed, I found myself remembering other conversations, other requests for help that had seemed urgent and necessary at the time. David's job had been restructuring, and he might be laid off, so they needed help with the mortgage. Amanda's car had unexpected repairs that coincidentally cost exactly the amount she'd been talking about spending on a designer handbag. The credit card debt was from medical expenses that they never explained and I never questioned. I worked, late into the night, reconstructing 18 months of manipulation with a clarity that felt both liberating and devastating. By the time I finally went to bed, I had filled 3 pages with entries, and I was beginning to see the pattern that had been invisible to me before. They never asked for money when things were going well. The requests always came after they'd made expensive purchases or when Amanda had mentioned something she wanted but couldn't afford. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams where I was standing on their porch again, hearing their laughter, feeling that moment of recognition when you realize you've been playing a game where only one side knew the rules. The next morning brought a text message from Amanda. "Thank you so much for helping with the business. You're the most generous mother-in-law in the world. Can't wait to show you the office space we're looking at." I stared at the message for a long time before responding with a simple heart emoji. If they wanted to play games, I was finally ready to learn the rules. Over the next few days, I found myself paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked. When David called to chat, I listened not just to what he said, but to what he didn't say. When Amanda posted photos on social media of expensive dinners and shopping trips, I screenshotted them and noted the dates. When they mentioned Amanda's business meetings that seemed to happen exclusively at high-end spas and boutiques, I started asking casual questions about her progress. "Oh, it's still in the early planning stages," Amanda would say when I asked about clients or business licenses. "These things take time to develop properly." Meanwhile, her social media told a different story. Photos of weekend trips to Atlantic City, expensive jewelry that appeared without explanation, dinners at restaurants where the cost of one meal could feed a family for a week. I began to understand that my $15,000 hadn't gone toward any business venture. It had simply funded another month of the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to living on my dime. The realization should have made me angry, and it did. But more than anger, I felt a strange sense of awakening, like I'd been sleepwalking for years and was finally opening my eyes. For the first time since Robert died, I began to think about what I wanted from my life, rather than just how I could help other people live theirs. A week after my discovery, David called with what he described as fantastic news. "Amanda found the perfect office space," he said, his voice bright with enthusiasm that I now recognized as carefully manufactured. "It's in this amazing building downtown, but the landlord wants first month, last month, and a security deposit up front. We're talking about $12,000. I sat in my garden, phone pressed to my ear, watching the roses I'd planted last spring bloom in shades of pink and red. Robert had always said I had a gift for growing things, for nurturing them into something beautiful. I wondered what he would think about how I'd been nurturing our son. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice level and warm. "Tell me more about this office space." David launched into a detailed description that sounded suspiciously like something he'd memorized. The square footage, the natural light, the proximity to potential clients. As he talked, I pulled up the real estate listings for downtown Philadelphia on my laptop, searching for commercial spaces that matched his description. "It sounds perfect," I said when he finished. "I'd love to see it. Maybe you could send me some photos, or better yet, we could tour it together." There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. "Oh, well, we're meeting with the landlord tomorrow to sign the papers," David said quickly. "It's one of those situations where we need to move fast, or we'll lose it to another tenant." "Of course," I replied. "These opportunities do tend to move quickly." After we hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, thinking about games and rules and the difference between being generous and being used. The roses around me were thriving because I'd given them what they needed: good soil, regular water, careful pruning when necessary. But I'd never given them so much that it hurt the rest of the garden. That evening, I transferred the $12,000 David had requested, but this time I did something different. I called my bank and spoke to my personal banker, a woman named Patricia, who had helped me manage Robert's estate. "Patricia," I said, "I need to set up some additional monitoring on my accounts. Nothing dramatic, just some alerts and safeguards to help me keep track of large transfers." "Of course. Mrs. Walsh," Patricia replied. "We can set up daily balance alerts, transaction summaries, even spending category reports if you'd like to see where your money is going." "That would be perfect," I said. "And Patricia, I'd like to schedule an appointment to review my overall financial picture. It's been a while since I've taken a comprehensive look at everything." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of control. For too long, I'd been reactive, responding to David and Amanda's requests without questioning or planning. Now, finally, I was taking charge of my own financial story. The appointment with Patricia was scheduled for the following Thursday, which gave me time to prepare. I spent the week organizing every piece of financial documentation I could find: bank statements, investment reports, insurance policies, even receipts for the gifts I'd given David and Amanda over the years. What I discovered surprised me. Despite all the money I'd given them, my financial position was still strong. Robert's life insurance had been more generous than I'd realized, and my own conservative spending habits meant that I'd barely touched the principal. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, with plenty left over for legitimate emergencies or genuine opportunities to help my family. But I also realized something else. The money I'd been giving David and Amanda wasn't helping them build a better life. It was enabling them to avoid building anything at all. Every time I solved their financial problems, I prevented them from learning to solve those problems themselves. I'd thought I was being a loving mother and mother-in-law. Instead, I'd been subsidizing their immaturity. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay inside with a cup of tea and a good book. Instead, I dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Robert's funeral, and drove to the bank with a folder full of documents and a head full of questions. Patricia greeted me with her usual professional warmth and led me to a private conference room where we spread my financial life across a mahogany table. For the next 2 hours, we went through everything: my assets, my expenses, my patterns of giving, and my long-term financial goals. "Mrs. Walsh," Patricia said as we reviewed the transfers to David and Amanda, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you considered whether this level of financial support is in everyone's best interest?" I looked at the numbers spread before us, $65,000 in 18 months, and felt that familiar mixture of pride and unease. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Well," Patricia said carefully, "in my experience, young adults who receive regular financial bailouts often struggle to develop the skills they need to manage money independently. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is allow their children to experience the natural consequences of their financial decisions." I thought about David and Amanda's laughter, their casual dismissal of my feelings, their confidence that I would always be there to solve their problems. Patricia was right, but it was more complicated than she knew. They weren't struggling to learn financial responsibility. They were actively choosing not to learn it because they didn't have to. "I think," I said slowly, "that it might be time for me to reconsider my approach to family financial support." Patricia smiled. "Would you like me to help you develop some guidelines? Something that might help you distinguish between legitimate emergencies and lifestyle maintenance?" We spent another hour creating what Patricia called a family financial assistance framework. It included criteria for different types of support, limits on frequency and amounts, and requirements for documentation and follow-up. By the time I left the bank, I had a clear set of boundaries that felt both generous and responsible. More importantly, I had a plan. That evening, I sat in Robert's old office and pulled out the spreadsheet I'd been maintaining since my discovery on David and Amanda's porch. I added a new column titled Response Strategy and began filling it in. If they were going to treat me like an ATM, then I was going to start operating like one, with clear terms, documented transactions, and consequences for misuse. The first test of my new approach came sooner than expected. On Saturday afternoon, Amanda called while I was reorganizing my closet, a task I'd been putting off for months. "Margaret!" Her voice was bright and bubbly, the tone she used when she wanted something. "I hope you're having a wonderful weekend. David and I were just talking about how grateful we are for everything you've done to help us get the business started." "You're very welcome, dear," I replied, sitting down on my bed with a stack of old blouses in my lap. "How is the office? Space working out?" There was a brief pause before Amanda laughed, a sound that seemed forced even through the phone. "Oh, well, there was a small complication with the lease. The landlord needed some additional documentation that's going to take a few weeks to process. But don't worry, we're using the time to really fine-tune our business plan." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. According to my research, there were no commercial properties matching David's description available for lease in downtown Philadelphia. I'd suspected as much, but Amanda's admission confirmed it. "That's wise," I said. "It's always better to take time to get things right." "Exactly." Amanda's relief was audible. "Which brings me to why I'm calling. We've been invited to this incredible networking event next weekend. It's specifically for emerging entrepreneurs, and it could be a fantastic opportunity for Amanda to meet potential clients and partners." "Here it comes," I thought. "The only thing is," Amanda continued, "it's in New York, and with the hotel, and registration fees and everything, it's going to cost about $3,000. I know it's a lot to ask, especially after everything you've already done, but this could really be the breakthrough we need." I looked at myself in the mirror across from my bed, seeing a woman who had spent years saying yes without thinking, giving without questioning, supporting without requiring accountability. "That does sound like a wonderful opportunity," I said. "Tell me more about the event. What's it called? Who's organizing it?" Another pause. Longer this time. It's called the Northeast Entrepreneur Summit," Amanda said, and I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "It's organized by, the Regional Business Development Association." I opened my laptop and began searching for these organizations while she talked. As I suspected, neither existed. "That's interesting," I said. "I'd love to learn more about it. Could you send me the website or some information about the agenda?" "Oh, absolutely," Amanda said quickly. "I'll email you everything this afternoon." "Perfect," I replied. "And Amanda, I've been thinking that it might be helpful for me to understand more about the business you're building. Do you think we could schedule some time next week for you to show me the business plan you mentioned? I'd love to see how you're planning to use all this investment." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Margaret?" Amanda's voice, when it finally came, was strained. "I think. Well, David is handling most of the business plan details. He's really the one with the head for numbers and strategy." "Of course," I said. "Then perhaps all three of us could sit down together. I'm sure David would be excited to share what he's been working on." "Yes," Amanda said faintly. "I'm sure he would." We hung up a few minutes later, after Amanda promised to coordinate schedules and send me information about the networking event. I knew I would never receive that information, just as I knew there was no business plan to review. But for the first time in our relationship, Amanda had heard something in my voice that made her uncertain. She was beginning to realize that I might not be as predictable as they'd assumed. I spent the rest of the weekend in a state of quiet anticipation. I'd drawn a line in the sand, established a boundary that would either be respected or crossed. Either way, I would learn something important about my relationship with David and Amanda. Monday morning brought an email from Amanda, exactly as I'd expected. But instead of information about a networking event, it was a carefully crafted explanation about why they'd decided not to attend after all. After giving it more thought, she wrote, David and I realized that we should focus our resources on getting the office situation sorted out before we start attending networking events. We're so grateful for your willingness to support us, but we've decided to be more conservative with our expenditures for now. I smiled as I read it. They'd gotten the message. The question was what they would do next. I didn't have to wait long to find out. David called that afternoon, his voice carefully casual. Hey, Mom. Amanda mentioned that you wanted to see our business plan. That's great. I'm really excited to share what we've been working on. The thing is, we're still in the development phase, and I want to make sure we have something really polished to show you. I understand, I said. These things do take time to develop properly. Exactly, David said, using the same phrase Amanda had used about the office space. Maybe we could plan something for next month? That would give us time to really put together a presentation that does justice to the vision we have. Of course, sweetheart, whenever you're ready. But even as I agreed to wait, I knew I was witnessing something important. For the first time since they'd been married, David and Amanda were having to adjust their plans based on my responses rather than simply assuming I would accommodate theirs. It was a small shift, but it felt significant. Over the next few weeks, our conversations took on a different quality. Where once David and Amanda had called with confident requests and assumed acceptance, now they approached me with more elaborate justifications and careful explanations. They seemed to be testing the waters, trying to figure out what had changed and how to navigate this new dynamic. I maintained my warm, supportive tone while asking more questions and requiring more details. When Amanda mentioned needing money for business supplies, I asked for receipts. When David talked about potential clients, I asked for names and contact information. When they described setbacks and complications, I offered sympathy, but also suggestions for alternative solutions that didn't involve my financial assistance. Gradually, the requests became less frequent. Not because their expenses had decreased, I suspected, but because the process of asking had become more complicated and less predictable. They were learning that I was no longer a guaranteed source of funding, and they were adjusting their behavior accordingly. But I was also learning something about myself. The woman who had spent 18 months writing checks without question was discovering that she had opinions about how her money should be used. The mother who had accepted every explanation without investigation was finding that she had the right to expect honesty from her adult children. The widow who had filled her empty hours by solving other people's problems was beginning to think about what she might want to do with her own life. 3 weeks after my conversation with Amanda about the networking event, I made a decision that surprised even me. I signed up for a pottery class at the local community center. I'd always been interested in working with clay, but Robert had preferred more traditional hobbies, and then after he died, I'd convinced myself that it was too late to start something new. But sitting in my house on a Tuesday afternoon, looking at rooms full of furniture and memories that belonged to a life I was no longer sure I wanted to keep living, I realized that 62 wasn't too old for anything. The pottery studio was in the basement of the community center, a bright space filled with wheels and kilns and the earthy smell of clay. My instructor was a woman named Carol, probably in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clay permanently embedded under her fingernails. First time? Carol asked as I stood uncertainly in the doorway, holding the bag of supplies I'd purchased at her recommendation. Yes, I admitted. I'm not sure I know what I'm doing. Carol smiled. Nobody does starting out. That's what makes it interesting. She was right. For the first time in years, I was doing something that I might fail at, something that required learning and practice and patience with myself. My first attempts at centering clay on the wheel were disasters, lopsided lumps that collapsed under their own weight. But gradually, with Carol's patient guidance and my own determination, I began to understand the relationship between pressure and support, between control and letting go. By the end of my first month of classes, I had produced several misshapen bowls and one reasonably successful mug. More importantly, I had discovered something I'd forgotten I possessed: the ability to be bad at something and enjoy it anyway. David and Amanda seemed puzzled by this new development when I mentioned it during one of our weekly phone calls. "Pottery," Amanda said, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "That's interesting. What made you decide to try that?" "I've always been curious about it," I replied, running my fingers over the surface of my latest creation, a small vase with an uneven rim that I found oddly charming. "It seemed like a good time to try new things." "Well, that's great," David said, though he sounded uncertain. "Just don't overdo it, Mom. You don't want to strain yourself." I almost laughed at the irony. Here I was, discovering new forms of creative expression and intellectual challenge, and my son was worried that I might be straining myself. Meanwhile, they'd been straining my bank account for 18 months without a moment's concern for the effort it took me to continually bail them out of their financial irresponsibility. But I kept these thoughts to myself. I was learning the value of observation over confrontation, of understanding over accusation. Every conversation with David and Amanda gave me more information about how they saw me and our relationship. And the more I understood, the better equipped I became to decide how I wanted that relationship to evolve. The pottery class also introduced me to something else I hadn't expected: new friendships. My classmates were a diverse group of women ranging in age from 30 to 80, united by our willingness to get our hands dirty and our tolerance for imperfection. We began meeting for coffee after class, sharing stories about our successes and failures both in clay and in life. It was during one of these coffee sessions that I found myself telling Carol about David and Amanda. I hadn't planned to share so much, but something about her calm presence and practical wisdom made it easy to talk. "They sound like they've learned to see you as a resource rather than a person," Carol said after I'd finished describing the past year and a half of financial requests and the conversation I'd overheard on their porch. "That's exactly what it feels like," I said, surprised by how accurately she'd captured something I'd been struggling to articulate. "The question is," Carol continued, "what kind of relationship do you want with them going forward? Because you get to decide that, you know. Just because someone is family doesn't mean you have to accept behavior that diminishes your sense of self-worth." That conversation stayed with me for days. I'd been so focused on how David and Amanda saw me that I'd lost sight of how I wanted to see myself. For too long, my identity had been wrapped up in being useful to other people, first as Robert's wife and then as David's financial safety net. But who was Margaret Walsh when she wasn't solving someone else's problems? I began to explore that, question through my pottery, creating pieces that pleased me rather than pieces I thought others might want. I signed up for a gardening workshop and learned about companion planting and organic pest control. I joined a book club at the library and discovered that I had strong opinions about contemporary fiction that I'd never bothered to express. Slowly, I was building a life that belonged to me, filled with activities and relationships that brought me joy rather than obligation. And as that life took shape, my tolerance for being treated as an ATM continued to diminish. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late September. I was in my pottery studio, actually a corner of the garage that I'd converted into a workspace, when my phone rang. It was David, and his voice carried the particular tension that I'd learned to associate with financial crises. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Amanda and I are in serious trouble." I set down the bowl I'd been trimming and gave him my full attention. "What kind of trouble?" "Financial trouble. Big time. Amanda's been, well, she's been making some bad decisions with money. Credit cards, mostly. And now we're looking at about $25,000 in debt that we can't handle." I felt that familiar tug of maternal concern, the instinct to fix and save and protect. But I also felt something else: skepticism. In the months since I'd started asking more questions and requiring more documentation, David and Amanda had been remarkably careful with their money. The sudden appearance of $25,000 in debt seemed suspiciously convenient. "That's a lot of money," I said carefully. "How did it accumulate so quickly?" David's explanation was elaborate and detailed, involving business expenses that hadn't been reimbursed, medical bills that insurance hadn't covered, and unexpected home repairs that couldn't be delayed. As he talked, I pulled up my computer and began taking notes, just as I'd learned to do with all their financial requests. "I need to ask you some questions," I said when he finished. "If this is really $25,000 in legitimate expenses, you should have documentation. Credit card statements, receipts, medical bills." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, do we really need to go through all that paperwork? I mean, I'm your son. Don't you trust me?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was so perfectly manipulative. For months, I'd been asking myself whether I could trust David and Amanda. Now he was turning that question around, making my request for basic financial documentation sound like a betrayal of family loyalty. "David," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning in my chest, "trust isn't about blind faith. It's about consistent honesty and respect. If you want me to help you with $25,000, then yes, I need to see the paperwork." Another long pause. "Fine," he said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "I'll gather everything together and bring it over this weekend." "That sounds perfect," I replied. "I'll look forward to seeing you both." But as I hung up the phone, I knew I wouldn't be seeing any paperwork that weekend. David and Amanda had been caught in their own web of lies, and they were finally beginning to understand that I was no longer willing to be an unwitting participant in their financial fiction. Saturday came and went without a visit or a phone call. Sunday afternoon brought a text message from Amanda. "David's not feeling well. We'll have to reschedule the financial discussion." I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about patterns and choices and the difference between helping and enabling. Then I typed back a response that would have been impossible for me to send 6 months earlier. "I'm sorry David isn't feeling well. When you're ready to have a serious conversation about your financial situation, complete with documentation, please let me know. Until then, I won't be providing any additional financial assistance." I sent the message before I could second guess myself, then turned off my phone and spent the rest of the afternoon in my garden, transplanting the mums I'd bought for fall color. The physical work felt good, grounding me in something real and immediate while my mind processed the magnitude of what I'd just done. For the first time in 18 months, I had said no to David and Amanda. Not maybe, not later, but no. The woman who had spent years prioritizing their financial comfort over her own emotional well-being had finally drawn a line that she was prepared to defend. As the sun set over my garden, painting the mums in shades of gold and burgundy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember: pride in my own choices. Whatever happened next, I was finally living as Margaret Walsh rather than as David's mother or Amanda's benefactor. The silence from Philadelphia stretched into its second week, and I found myself settling into a routine that felt both familiar and entirely new. My mornings still began with coffee and eggs, but now they included time spent planning my day, around activities I enjoyed rather than problems I needed to solve. My pottery was improving, my garden was thriving, and my book club had started meeting at my house because everyone loved the chocolate chip cookies I'd learned to make from Robert's grandmother's recipe. But most importantly, I was sleeping through the night for the first time since David's wedding. The constant low-level anxiety that had become my normal state, the feeling that I was always waiting for the next financial crisis or emotional emergency had finally begun to fade. I was remembering what it felt like to live in my own life, rather than constantly managing everyone else's. The call came on a Wednesday evening as I was cleaning up after dinner. Not from David or Amanda, but from a number I didn't recognize with a Philadelphia area code. Mrs. Walsh? This is Jennifer Martinez from First National Bank. I'm calling about your son David Dawson and his wife Amanda. They've listed you as a reference on a loan application. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of loan? A personal loan for $30,000. They've indicated that you would be willing to co-sign the application. The audacity of it took my breath away. Not only had they lied about my willingness to co-sign a loan, they'd increased the amount they were trying to extract from our family's finances. I told Jennifer Martinez that I had never agreed to co-sign any loan and would not be doing so under any circumstances. Her professional composure slipped slightly as she processed this information, clearly realizing that David and Amanda had misrepresented our arrangement. After confirming that the bank would be denying their application, I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the wall where Robert's favorite painting used to hang before I'd redecorated according to my own tastes. The loan application was a line crossed, a boundary violated so completely that there could be no pretending it was a misunderstanding or miscommunication. They had been willing to legally bind me to their debt without my knowledge or consent. The realization settled into my bones like winter cold, permanent and transformative. I walked to my home office and opened the spreadsheet I'd been maintaining since that afternoon on their porch. Under David's name, I added a new entry. Attempted unauthorized loan co-signing, $30,000. Status: prevented by bank verification process. Trust level: irreparably damaged. Then I did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I opened a new document and began drafting what I mentally called my Independence Declaration. It was a letter to David and Amanda, clearly outlining the boundaries I was establishing going forward. No more financial assistance without prior discussion and complete documentation. No more emergency bailouts for lifestyle choices disguised as crises. No more assumption that my resources were available for their convenience. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about the pottery class and Carol's wisdom about the difference between support and enabling. Good clay needed just enough pressure to hold its shape, but too much pressure would collapse the entire structure. I'd been applying the wrong kind of pressure to David and Amanda's lives, supporting their poor decisions rather than helping them develop the strength to make better ones. The letter took me 3 drafts to complete. The first was too angry, full of accusations and hurt feelings that would only put them on the defensive. The second was too apologetic, undermining my own boundaries with explanations and justifications they didn't deserve. The third struck the right balance. Clear, firm, and focused on future expectations rather than past grievances. Before I could lose my nerve, I printed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and drove to the post office to send it via certified mail. If David and Amanda wanted to play financial games, they would learn that I was no longer a passive participant. The response came faster than I'd expected. My phone started ringing at 7:30 the next morning, David's name flashing on the screen with an urgency that I recognized but no longer felt compelled to accommodate. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while I drank my coffee and watched the morning light filter through my kitchen windows. Mom, what the hell is this letter supposed to mean? Amanda's practically in tears, and honestly, I don't understand where this is coming from. We're family. Since when do we need formal documentation to help each other out? Call me back. We need to talk about this before you do something you'll regret. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Something I'll regret, as if establishing reasonable boundaries with my own money was a mistake that would somehow harm me more than it harmed them. I deleted the message and went about my morning routine, which now included a 20-minute meditation practice I'd learned in a stress management workshop at the community center. The calls continued throughout the day. David, then Amanda, then David again. Dawson and Ms. Riley have been running what appears to be an investment scam targeting elderly individuals in the Philadelphia area. They've been promising high returns on business investments, collecting money from victims, then using those funds to finance their personal lifestyle. She showed me photographs of David and Amanda at various social events, always dressed expensively, always surrounded by well-dressed older adults who looked like they had money to invest. There were copies of fake business documents, fraudulent investment prospectuses, and bank records showing deposits from multiple victims. The interesting thing, Sarah continued, is that your financial relationship with them appears to be different from the others. While you've certainly given them substantial amounts of money, there's no evidence that they used false business propositions to obtain it from you. It looks more like traditional family financial support. I thought about the fake interior, design business, the non-existent office space, the imaginary networking events. David and Amanda had been practicing their scam techniques on me before expanding to other victims. I had been their proof of concept, the guinea pig who taught them how to manipulate older adults with money. How many people have they defrauded? I asked. At least 12 that we know of, probably more. The total amount is approaching $400,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. While I had been agonizing over whether to give them $15,000 here and $20,000 there, they had been systematically destroying the financial security of a dozen other families. My money hadn't just enabled their lifestyle, it had funded their criminal enterprise. We'd like your cooperation in building the case against them, Sarah said. Your documentation of their requests and your intimate knowledge of their methods could be crucial in helping us establish a pattern of deceptive behavior. I thought about my spreadsheet, my careful records of every lie and manipulation. What had started as a way to understand my own situation had become evidence of a larger, criminal conspiracy. Of course, I said. I'll help however I can. We spent the next 2 hours going through my records. Sarah was particularly interested in the evolution of David and Amanda's requests, how they had tested different stories and strategies with me before perfecting their approach for other victims. She photographed documents, took detailed notes, and asked me to write out a timeline of our financial interactions. Mrs. Walsh, she said as she prepared to leave, I want you to know that you're not responsible for what they did to other people. The fact that they manipulated you doesn't make you complicit in their crimes. I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed her. If I had been more skeptical earlier, if I had asked harder questions or demanded better documentation, would other people have been spared? The guilt felt almost as heavy as the betrayal. That evening, I called Carol from my pottery class. Of all the new friends I'd made, she seemed the most likely to understand the complex emotions I was struggling with. You can't blame yourself for trusting your own son, she said after I'd explained the situation. The fact that he violated that trust to hurt other people reflects on his character, not yours. But if I had been smarter, more suspicious, then you would have been a different kind of person, Carol interrupted gently. The kind of person who doesn't trust her own family, who assumes the worst about people she loves. Is that really who you want to be? I thought about that conversation for a long time after we hung up. Part of me did want to be harder, more suspicious, less vulnerable to manipulation. But I also recognized that those qualities came with their own costs. The woman I was becoming, stronger, more independent, better at setting boundaries, was still fundamentally the same person who had raised David with love and generosity. The problem wasn't my capacity for trust, it was David and Amanda's willingness to exploit it. 2 days later, I learned that David and Amanda had been arrested. Sarah Chen called to let me know that they had been taken into custody at their townhouse, which had apparently been under surveillance for several weeks. The police had also executed search warrants on their bank accounts, computers, and personal belongings. We found evidence of additional victims, Sarah told me. The scope of their operation was larger than we initially realized. Your cooperation has been invaluable in helping us understand how they operated. I felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that they could no longer hurt other people. Sadness that my son had chosen a path that led to this inevitable conclusion. But underneath both emotions was something else, a sense of completion, as if a chapter of my life that had been dragging on far too long was finally reaching its end. The local news picked up the story within hours of the arrests. "Local couple charged in elder fraud scheme," read the headline in the evening paper. There was David's college graduation photo, the same one I kept on my desk alongside Amanda's. Professional headshot from her abandoned real estate career. Each message grew progressively more desperate and manipulative. By evening, Amanda had shifted tactics entirely, leaving a tearful voicemail about how much they loved me and how worried they were about my mental state. "Margaret, honey, we're concerned that you might be having some kind of breakdown. Isolating yourself, making these sudden changes to family relationships. Maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist or counselor. We just want what's best for you." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. The same woman who had called me predictable and pathetic, who had kept a spreadsheet of my generosity like a hunting ledger, was now positioning herself as concerned about my well-being. But I also recognized the strategy behind it. If they could, convince people that my new boundaries were symptoms of mental instability, they could undermine my credibility while maintaining their victim status. That evening, I called my doctor's office and scheduled a complete physical exam, including a mental health screening. If David and Amanda wanted to question my competency, I would have professional documentation of my psychological stability. But more than that, I wanted to confirm for myself that the changes I was making came from a place of strength rather than bitterness. Dr. Patricia Henley had been my physician for 15 years, seeing me through Robert's final illness and my adjustment to widowhood. She was a practical woman in her 50s who believed in addressing problems directly rather than dancing around uncomfortable truths. "Margaret," she said as she reviewed my test results a week later, "I have to say, you seem like a completely different person than the woman I saw 6 months ago. Your blood pressure is better, you've lost weight in a healthy way, and your stress markers are significantly improved. Whatever changes you've been making in your life, they're working." I told her about the pottery classes, the gardening workshops, the book club, and my decision to establish financial boundaries with David and Amanda. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "It sounds like you're finally living for yourself instead of managing everyone else's choices," she said when I finished. "That's a significant transition for someone who spent most of their adult life in caretaker roles." "My son and daughter-in-law seem to think I'm having some kind of breakdown," I admitted. Dr. Henley smiled. "In my experience, when people accuse others of having breakdowns for setting healthy boundaries, it usually means those boundaries are threatening something they don't want to lose. You're not having a breakdown, Margaret. You're having a breakthrough." She offered to provide a letter documenting my mental and physical health if I felt it necessary, but I declined. I didn't need to defend my sanity to people who had spent 18 months attacking my bank account. Their accusations said more about their desperation than about my stability. The harassment continued for another week, with David and Amanda alternating between guilt trips, threats, and increasingly elaborate emergencies that supposedly required my immediate financial intervention. Amanda's car had supposedly been totaled in an accident. David claimed he was being threatened by loan sharks. They needed money for a lawyer, for medical bills, for rent that was apparently 3 months overdue, despite my recent contributions to their household expenses. Each story was more dramatic than the last, and each one crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. When I asked for police reports about the car accident, Amanda claimed they were still being processed. When I suggested that David report the loan, shark threats to law enforcement, he suddenly remembered that the situation had been resolved through other means. Every emergency evaporated the moment I asked for verification or suggested involving appropriate authorities. But the lies weren't what bothered me most. It was the assumption underlying every fabricated crisis, that I was stupid enough to believe them, desperate enough to help regardless of the circumstances, and isolated enough that I had no one else to turn to for perspective. They had built their financial strategy around a version of me that no longer existed, and they seemed genuinely shocked that I had evolved beyond their expectations. 3 weeks after sending my letter, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes when a car pulled into my driveway. For a moment, I thought David and Amanda had finally decided to confront me in person. But the woman who emerged from the silver sedan was someone I didn't recognize. She was perhaps 40 years old, professionally dressed, carrying a briefcase, and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested official business. As she approached my garden gate, I set down my basket of tomatoes and walked over to meet her. "Mrs. Walsh? I'm Sarah Chen from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. I'm investigating a case involving financial fraud, and your name has come up in connection with David Dawson and Amanda Riley." My blood turned to ice water. Whatever David and Amanda had been doing with the money I'd given them, it had apparently escalated beyond simple lying to family members. "What kind of fraud?" I asked, gesturing for her to follow me to the porch where we could sit and talk privately. Sarah Chen opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Mr." They looked so young and promising in those pictures, so full of potential that had somehow curdled into criminality. My phone rang constantly for the next few days as friends and neighbors called to express their shock and support. Many of them had known David since he was a child, had watched him grow up in our community, had celebrated his achievements alongside me. Their calls were kind but painful, reminders of how thoroughly the person I thought I knew had been a construction rather than a reality. The most difficult call came from Robert's sister Helen, who lived in Arizona and had stayed in touch with me since his death. She had always been fond of David, sending him birthday cards and Christmas gifts, bragging to her friends about her brilliant nephew who was making his mark in the business world. "Margaret, I just saw the news online," she said, her voice full of concern. "Are you okay? Do you need me to come stay with you for a while?" "I'm okay," I told her, and was surprised to realize that I meant it. "It's been a shock, but I'm managing." How could this happen? David was such a sweet boy. Remember how he used to help Robert with the yard work every summer? And he was so good with money, always saving his allowance and planning for the future. I did remember those things, and they made the present situation even more surreal. The boy who had carefully counted his allowance money and refused to spend it on candy had become a man who stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from elderly strangers. Somewhere along the way, his natural caution with money had transformed into an obsession with acquiring it through any means necessary. "People change," I said finally. "Sometimes in ways we never expect." After I hung up with Helen, I sat in my living room looking at the photo albums I'd pulled out during the weeks of police interviews. Pictures of David's childhood, his school, achievements, family vacations, birthday parties. The visual evidence of a normal, loving family that had somehow produced this outcome. But as I looked more carefully at the photos, I began to notice things I'd missed before. In family pictures, David was often standing slightly apart from Robert and me, his smile perfunctory rather than genuine. At his high school graduation, while Robert and I beamed with pride, David's expression was calculating, already focused on what came next, rather than celebrating what he'd accomplished. Even in his college photos, surrounded by friends and opportunities, there was something detached about his demeanor, as if he was performing the role of a successful young man rather than actually being one. Had those signs always been there? Or was I retrofitting my memories to make sense of the present? I couldn't be sure, but I was beginning to understand that the David I thought I knew had been as much a construction as Amanda's fake pregnancy or their imaginary business ventures. I had loved the idea of my son so completely that I'd failed to see the actual person he was becoming. The legal proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. David and Amanda's lawyer apparently advised them to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a trial that would expose the full extent of their crimes. They pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and were sentenced to 3 years in prison, plus restitution to their victims. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom and watching my son in his orange jumpsuit as the judge read the charges against him. When given the opportunity to address the court, David offered a brief apology that sounded more like a public relations statement than genuine remorse. He expressed regret for his actions, acknowledged the harm he'd caused, and promised to make amends. But he never looked at the victims section of the courtroom, never made eye contact with the people whose savings he'd stolen. Amanda's statement was more emotional, but equally hollow. She cried as she spoke about the mistakes she'd made and the people she'd hurt. But her tears seemed calculated rather than sincere. Even in that moment, facing the consequences of her actions, she was still performing rather than being authentic. When the judge asked if any victims wanted to make impact statements, several elderly people stood to describe how David and Amanda's crimes had affected their lives. A retired teacher who had lost her nest egg, a widower who had given them money meant for his grandchildren's education, a couple in their 70s who had invested their life savings based on David's promises of guaranteed returns. Each story was heartbreaking, but what struck me most was how similar their experiences had been to my own. The same elaborate business, stories, the same urgent timelines, the same assurances that their money would be safe and profitable. The only difference was that these people had been promised financial returns while I had been offered emotional satisfaction. We had all been manipulated, but I had been manipulated by someone who was supposed to love me. After the sentencing, I approached several of the victims to introduce myself and offer my apologies. Most were gracious, understanding that I had been deceived just as they had been. But one woman, Mrs. Patterson, looked at me with barely concealed anger. "You're his mother," she said. "How could you not know what kind of person he was?" I had been asking myself the same question for months, and I still didn't have a satisfactory answer. How do you explain that you can live with someone, love someone, support someone for decades and still not truly know them? How do you reconcile the boy who brought you dandelions on Mother's Day with the man who steals from strangers? "I don't know," I told her honestly. "I thought I knew him, but I was wrong." Mrs. Patterson studied my face for a long moment, then her expression softened slightly. "I guess we all thought we knew them," she said. "That's how they were able to fool us." Driving home from the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't realized was there. The legal proceedings were over, David and Amanda were facing the consequences of their choices, and I was finally free to move forward without wondering what crisis would emerge next. But I also felt something else: gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what I had learned about myself in the process. The woman who had sat in her kitchen 18 months ago, automatically agreeing to transfer $15,000 without asking a single question, had evolved into someone who could withstand family pressure, police investigations, and public scrutiny while maintaining her sense of self-worth. I had learned to trust my own judgment, to value my own needs, to recognize the difference between love and exploitation. I had discovered interests and friendships that belonged to me rather than existing in service of someone else's agenda. Most importantly, I had learned that it was possible to love someone deeply while still protecting yourself from their destructive choices. The next morning, I called Sarah Chen to ask about the restitution process. While David and Amanda's assets would be liquidated to compensate their victims, the amount recovered would likely be a fraction of what had been stolen. I wanted to know if there was a way for me to contribute to the restitution fund, to help repair some of the damage that my money had indirectly enabled. "That's very generous of you, Mrs. Walsh," Sarah said. "But you were a victim too. You have no legal obligation to compensate other victims." "I understand that," I replied. "But I have a moral obligation to myself. I need to know that I'm part of the solution, not just someone who got caught up in the problem. We arranged for me to make a substantial contribution to the Victim Compensation Fund, money that would be distributed among the people David and Amanda had defrauded. It wouldn't restore everything they'd lost, but it would help some of them rebuild their financial security. Making that contribution felt like the final step in reclaiming my agency. For too long, my money had been used to enable destructive behavior and ultimately to harm innocent people. Now, finally, it was being used to repair damage and provide genuine help to people who needed it. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from David. It was the first direct communication I'd had from him since his arrest, and I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of me didn't want to read whatever justifications or manipulations it might contain. But another part of me was curious to see whether prison had prompted any genuine self-reflection. The letter was shorter than I'd expected, and more honest than I'd dared to hope. David acknowledged that he had been using me financially for years, that he had taken advantage of my grief after Robert's death, and that he had involved me unknowingly in crimes that hurt innocent people. He didn't ask for money, didn't request visits, and didn't make excuses for his behavior. He simply apologized and told me that he understood if I never wanted to see him again. It was the first time since his childhood that David had communicated with me without wanting something in return. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken a prison cell to strip away his manipulation and reveal whatever genuine remorse he might possess. I wrote back, not because I was ready to forgive or reconcile, but because I wanted him to know that I was building a new life based on my own choices, rather than reactions to his behavior. I told him about my pottery classes, my garden, my volunteer, work with the Victim Compensation Program. I explained that I was proud of the woman I was becoming, and that I hoped he would use his time in prison to become someone he could be proud of as well. I didn't promise to visit or to resume financial support when he was released. I didn't offer false reassurances about the future of our relationship. But I did tell him that I loved him enough to stop enabling him, and that I hoped someday he would understand the difference between those two things. The response to that letter never came, and I was glad. Our relationship, if it was to continue at all, would need to be rebuilt from the ground up based on honesty and mutual respect. That kind of reconstruction couldn't happen through letters or prison visits. It would require David to prove through his actions that he had genuinely changed, and it would require me to maintain the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. As autumn settled over my garden and my pottery pieces accumulated on the windowsills of my kitchen, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained. The financial cost of David and Amanda's deception had been significant but not devastating. The emotional cost had been much higher, but it had also prompted growth that might never have happened otherwise. I was no longer the woman who said yes without thinking, who gave without questioning, who prioritized other people's comfort over her own well-being. I had learned to value my own judgment, to trust my own instincts, to recognize my own worth independent of my usefulness to others. These were lessons that would serve me well for the rest of my life, regardless of what happened with David. One evening in late October, as I was glazing a set of bowls I'd made for the community center's holiday fundraiser, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I felt the old familiar anxiety that had once accompanied every unexpected phone call or visitor. But then I remembered that I was no longer waiting for the next crisis, no longer responsible for managing other people's emergencies. When I opened the door, I found Carol from my pottery class standing on my porch with a bottle of wine and a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," she said. "I was in the neighborhood and thought you might like some company." I invited her in, and we spent the evening sitting in my living room, drinking wine and talking about everything except David and Amanda. We discussed our pottery projects, shared stories about our families, and made plans for the community center's upcoming art show. It was the kind of easy, comfortable friendship that I'd forgotten was possible. As Carol prepared to leave, she paused at my front door and looked around at my living room, which I'd redecorated over the summer in colors and styles that reflected my own taste rather than Robert's or David's expectations. "You know," she said, "this house feels completely different than it did when I first visited. It feels like you now." After she left, I walked through my house, seeing it with fresh eyes. She was right. Every room reflected choices I'd made. For myself, from the pottery pieces displayed on my bookshelves to the photographs I'd chosen to frame and hang. Even the furniture arrangement was different, configured for my comfort rather than for hosting family gatherings that had become more obligation than celebration. I had created a space that was truly mine, filled with evidence of interests I'd pursued and friendships I'd cultivated and achievements I'd earned through my own efforts. It was a home rather than just a house, a sanctuary rather than just a place to wait for other people to need me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop, updating the spreadsheet that had begun as a record of financial manipulation. But now it served a different purpose. Instead of tracking David and Amanda's lies, I was recording my own accomplishments. Pottery classes completed, books read, friendships formed, boundaries maintained, contributions made to causes I cared about. The numbers told a story of transformation, of a woman who had emerged from betrayal and loss with a stronger sense of herself and a clearer vision of the life she wanted to live. It wasn't the life I'd planned when Robert died, or the one I'd imagined when David got married, but it was mine in a way that felt both authentic and sustainable. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that I was no longer angry with David and Amanda. The rage that had sustained me through the early days of discovery had transformed into something more useful: determination to live well despite their attempts to diminish me. They had tried to reduce me to an ATM, a resource to be exploited, until it was exhausted. Instead, they had inadvertently forced me to discover reserves of strength and independence I didn't know I possessed. The woman who had once measured her worth by her ability to solve other people's problems had learned to value herself for who she was rather than what she could provide. The mother who had confused enabling with love had discovered that true care sometimes required saying no. The widow who had lost herself in grief and manipulation had found her way back to a life worth living. In the months that followed, I would continue to grow and change, to explore new interests and deepen existing friendships. I would contribute to causes that mattered to me, create art that brought me joy, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. I would learn that independence wasn't about isolation, but about choosing how to connect with others from a position of strength rather than need. But all of that was still to come. For now, it was enough to know that I had survived the worst betrayal of my life and emerged not just intact, but improved. I had learned to suffocate their access to my money without suffocating my own capacity for generosity. I had discovered that setting boundaries wasn't cruel but kind, both to myself and ultimately to the people who needed to learn to stand on their own. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was older than the one who had answered David's first call for money 2 years earlier. But she was also stronger, wiser, and more at peace with herself. She knew her own worth, trusted her own judgment, and wasn't afraid to defend her own interests. She was exactly who I had needed to become. 6 months after the sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I had learned about boundaries and forgiveness. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional but warm, introducing herself as Dr. Linda Morrison from the state correctional facility where David was serving his sentence. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm calling because your son has requested permission to participate in our family reconciliation program. It's a therapeutic initiative designed to help inmates address the harm they've caused to their loved ones and begin the process of making genuine amends." I listened as Dr. Morrison explained the program's structure. It wasn't about immediate forgiveness or reconciliation, she emphasized, but about creating a safe space for honest communication. David would undergo months of counseling before any direct contact, and my participation was entirely voluntary with the right to withdraw at any time. What would be required of me? I asked, surprised by my own curiosity about the program. Initially, just a willingness to receive letters that have been reviewed by our therapeutic team. These aren't requests for money or visits, but structured exercises in accountability and genuine remorse. If you choose to respond, those letters would also be reviewed to ensure healthy communication patterns. I thought about the brief letter David had sent months earlier, the first honest communication I'd received from him in years. Perhaps supervised therapeutic correspondence could help us both process what had happened without falling back into old patterns of manipulation and enabling. I'll consider it, I told Dr. Morrison, but I need time to think. That evening, I called Carol to discuss the opportunity. She listened thoughtfully as I explained the program and my conflicted feelings about participating. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked finally. "That I'm not ready to forgive him, but I might be ready to understand him," I replied. "I keep wondering if there's something I missed, some way I failed him that contributed to who he became." "Margaret," Carol said gently, "you've spent the last year learning to stop taking responsibility for other people's choices. Don't start backsliding now." She was right, but I also recognized that my desire to understand wasn't the same as accepting blame. I wanted to comprehend how the boy I'd raised had become the man who'd stolen from elderly strangers, not because I needed to justify his behavior, but because I needed to complete my own healing process. After a week of consideration, I agreed to participate in the letter exchange program. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later, delivered through the prison's therapeutic services department rather than regular mail. Dr. Morrison had included a note explaining that David had written it during a counseling session focused on accountability and had rewritten it multiple times based on therapeutic feedback. The letter was unlike anything David had ever written to me. Instead of requests or justifications, it contained a detailed acknowledgement of specific ways he had manipulated and deceived me over the years. He wrote about exploiting my grief after Robert's death, about calculating exactly how much money he could extract before I became suspicious, about viewing me as a resource rather than a person. Most painfully, he described the process of involving Amanda in the deception, teaching her which emotional triggers were most effective in securing my financial support. Reading about their strategic discussions of my vulnerability felt like reliving the betrayal, but it also provided clarity about the systematic nature of their exploitation. The letter concluded with something I'd never expected from David, a genuine apology that didn't ask for anything in return. He acknowledged that his actions had caused lasting damage to our relationship and expressed understanding if I chose never to see him again. He didn't promise to change or ask for another chance. He simply took responsibility for the pain he'd caused. I sat with that letter for several days before deciding to respond. When I did write back, I focused on my own journey rather than his crimes. I told him about the pottery classes, the friendships I'd formed, the volunteer work I'd begun with elderly victims of financial fraud. I described the woman I was becoming and the life I was building based on my own choices rather than reactions to his behavior. I also wrote honestly about the impact of his betrayal, not to punish him, but to help him understand the full scope of the damage. I explained how his actions had shattered my ability to trust my own judgment, how I'd questioned every decision I'd made as a parent, how I'd isolated myself from friends and family out of shame and confusion. But I also wrote about recovery and growth, about learning to value myself independent of my usefulness to others. I wanted him to understand that while his crimes had caused significant harm, they had also inadvertently pushed me toward a stronger, more authentic version of myself. The correspondence continued for several months, with letters arriving every few weeks. Each exchange felt like peeling back layers of deception and misunderstanding that had accumulated over years. David wrote about the pressure he'd felt to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford, about how small lies had gradually escalated into criminal behavior, about the way success had become defined entirely by material possessions and social status. I wrote about the loneliness of widowhood, about how my eagerness to help had sometimes blinded me to the difference between genuine need and manufactured crisis. I shared insights from my therapy sessions with a counselor I'd started seeing to process the trauma of betrayal, and I described how I was learning to form relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. What surprised me most about these letters was how they helped me understand not just David's choices, but my own. I began to see how my generous nature had sometimes enabled poor decision-making, how my fear of conflict had prevented me from asking necessary questions, how my desire to be needed had made me vulnerable to manipulation. But I also came to understand that none of these insights diminished David's responsibility for his crimes or justified the harm he'd caused to me and his other victims. Understanding the dynamics that had contributed to our unhealthy relationship didn't excuse the choices he'd made or obligate me to resume financial support when he was released. 8 months into the letter exchange, Dr. Morrison called to invite me to participate in a face-to-face meeting with David as part of his pre-release preparation. The meeting would take place in a supervised therapeutic setting with clear boundaries and safety protocols. David has made significant progress in his counseling, Dr. Morrison explained. But he understands that any future relationship with you depends entirely on your comfort level and boundaries. This meeting would be an opportunity for both of you to have closure, regardless of whether you choose to maintain contact after his release. I agreed to the meeting, partly out of curiosity about who David had become during his incarceration, and partly because I wanted to test my own emotional stability in his presence. If I was truly as strong and independent as I believed, I should be able to face him without falling back into old patterns of accommodation and enabling. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the prison, with Dr. Morrison present as a mediator. David entered wearing standard prison clothing, looking older and more serious than I remembered. The cocky confidence that had characterized his adult demeanor was gone, replaced by something that seemed like genuine humility. For the first few minutes, we simply looked at each other across the table, both of us grappling with how much had changed since our last conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I expected. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," I replied honestly. What followed was the most honest conversation David and I had ever had. With Dr. Morrison's gentle guidance, we talked about specific incidents from his childhood and adolescence that had contributed to his sense of entitlement. David acknowledged that he'd learned early to manipulate my emotions to get what he wanted, starting with small things like extended bedtimes or expensive toys and gradually escalating to significant financial support. I shared my own insights about how my parenting style had sometimes prioritized his immediate happiness over teaching him resilience and accountability. I explained how my fear of his disappointment had led me to solve problems for him rather than helping him develop problem-solving skills. But we also talked about the present and future. David described his work in the prison's financial literacy program, where he was learning to help other inmates understand budgeting and debt management. He spoke about his plans for after release, which included finding employment and living in a halfway house rather than expecting family support. Most importantly, he made it clear that he understood our relationship could never return to what it had been before. He acknowledged that trust, once broken so completely, might never be fully restored, and he expressed respect for whatever boundaries I chose to maintain. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said near the end of our meeting. "I don't even think I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I took from you, and it wasn't just money. I stole your peace of mind, your ability to trust your own judgment, your faith in family relationships. That's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. Hearing him articulate the full scope of his betrayal was both painful and healing. For months, I'd struggled to explain to friends and counselors exactly what David had taken from me. Financial losses could be calculated and eventually recovered, but the psychological damage was harder to quantify and repair. Having him acknowledge that damage validated my experience in a way that felt crucial to my continued healing. I left the prison that day with a sense of closure I hadn't expected to find. David had faced the full consequences of his actions and seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding his life on an honest foundation. Whether that commitment would survive the challenges of reintegration remained to be seen, but it was no longer my responsibility to ensure his success. 3 months later, David was released from prison. He sent me a brief note with his new address and phone number, not asking for contact, but ensuring I could reach him if needed. He was living in a supervised facility and working at a nonprofit organization that helped other ex-offenders find employment and housing. I didn't call or visit, but I did send him a card on his birthday with a simple message: "Wishing you success in building an honest life." It was the kind of relationship I could manage now, one based on mutual respect and clear boundaries, rather than financial obligation and emotional manipulation. Meanwhile, my own life continued to flourish in ways I couldn't have imagined 2 years earlier. The pottery studio in my garage had become a sanctuary where I created pieces that reflected my growing confidence and artistic vision. Several of my works had been selected for display in the community center's permanent collection, and I'd begun teaching basic pottery techniques to other seniors. The garden that had once been Robert's domain had been completely redesigned according to my preferences, with raised beds for vegetables and a meditation area surrounded by flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. I joined the local Master Gardener program and was working toward certification as a volunteer educator. Most significantly, I'd developed a circle of genuine friendships based on shared interests rather than family obligation or financial dependency. Carol and I had become particularly close, taking weekend trips to art museums and pottery shows, sharing meals and conversations that enriched both our lives. I'd also begun dating, something I never thought I'd do again after Robert's death. Thomas was a retired teacher I'd met at the library's book club, a gentle man with a dry sense of humor and no interest in my financial situation. Our relationship developed slowly, built on compatibility and mutual respect rather than need or desperation. When I told Thomas about David's crimes and our complicated relationship, he listened without judgment and asked thoughtful questions about how the experience had changed me. He understood that my past included both trauma and growth, and he was attracted to the strong, independent woman I'd become rather than intimidated by the journey that had shaped me. One evening, as Thomas and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint my garden in shades of gold and pink, he asked a question that made me reflect on how far I'd traveled from the woman who'd automatically transferred $15,000 without asking a single question. "Do you ever regret what happened with David?" he asked. "Not the crimes, but the way it forced you to change your life so dramatically?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman I'd been versus the woman I'd become. The old Margaret had been generous but naive, loving but enabling, supportive but ultimately self-destructive in her inability to set boundaries. The new Margaret was still generous but strategic, still loving but wise enough to protect herself, still supportive but in ways that actually helped rather than harmed. "I regret the pain it caused everyone involved," I said finally. "But I don't regret becoming someone who values herself enough to say no when necessary." As I spoke those words, I realized they represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with betrayal, but led to liberation. David and Amanda had tried to reduce me to a financial resource, to suffocate my independence by making me dependent on their approval and grateful for their presence in my life. Instead, they had inadvertently taught me to suffocate their access to my resources while expanding my own independence in ways I'd never imagined possible. In trying to diminish me, they had forced me to discover my own strength. In trying to control me, they had pushed me to claim my own autonomy. The irony wasn't lost on me that the son who had accused me of suffocating his independence had been the one who was truly suffocating, not just my financial resources, but my sense of self-worth and personal agency. By cutting off his access to my money, I had freed both of us from a relationship dynamic that was ultimately destructive for everyone involved. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life I'd built from the ashes of betrayal. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was authentically mine, in a way that felt both powerful and peaceful. I had learned to love without losing myself, to give without being exploited, to trust without being naive. Most importantly, I had learned that independence wasn't about isolation, but about choosing how to connect with others from a position of strength rather than desperation. The woman who had once measured her worth by her ability to solve other people's problems had discovered that her greatest value lay in being truly herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.